I think we're good to start. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today in discussing to understand and support early childhood education in Pittsburgh and beyond. Today's event is part of Civic Action Week, and that is a collaboration of a week-long event with PitServes and the ECA at the university. And yeah, I'm really excited to engage in today's conversation and all. But before we formally get started, I would like to do a land acknowledgement, and I'll be reading a message which was created by Pitt Sustainability. And that is that we recognize the University of Pittsburgh occupies the ancestral lands of the Adeno culture, Hopewell culture, and the Monongahela peoples, who were later joined by refugees of other tribes, including the Delaware, Shawnee, and Haudenosaunee. Driven here from their homelands by colonizers, we honor these traditional native inhabitants of this place and uplift their historic, unique, and enduring relationship with this land, which is their ancestral territory. We pay our respects to their elders and their past, present, and future people, community, and culture. While we cannot change the past, we commit to continued gratitude for the gifts of nature, along with the ongoing respect, care, and stewardship of the land, each other, and future generations. And you can find more about that on the Pitt Sustainability website, but I think that is all we want to share, and good to get started. So my name is Sam Hyun. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a volunteer coordinator at Jumpstart. And then I'll also leave it to Sri to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Sri. I'm also a volunteer coordinator for Jumpstart with Sam this year, and my pronouns are also she and her.
Yeah, and a little bit about Jumpstart. We are a nationwide nonprofit, and we work with communities to serve preschool-age children in expanding their literacy and social-emotional skills through reading and planned activities. But today we're actually going to be joined by our lovely panelists who have years of experience with Jumpstart, reading on children. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce one of our panelists, Emily Garcia. She is the Assistant Director of ECE Initiatives and Field Placement in the College of Education and Human Development at Temple University. Emily began her career in preschool classrooms while serving with Jumpstart for young children. She now supports various early childhood grant-funded initiatives and leads field placement for education-related programs in the college. In addition, Emily serves as an adjunct professor for multiple departments. She earned her bachelor's degree in early childhood and elementary education, as well as her master's degree in special education from Temple University. And then our second panelist today is Sharon Geibel of 3RS. She holds a BA from La Roche University and an MSW from the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work. She brings her history as a behavioral health clinician, researcher, and program director to her work with 3RS. From 2006 to 2019, she worked as an early childhood mental health consultant serving the counties that made up the Southwest Regional Key. And yeah, I think that was that. And I'm really excited to hear from them. And so we're just going to get right into it. And Emily and or Sharon, any of y'all are more than welcome to begin. But yeah, I would say, just to preface for our friends who maybe aren't totally familiar with early childhood education and hopped onto the Zoom or watching from YouTube, how would you describe the current state of early childhood education in America, and specifically the state of Pennsylvania?
I'm happy to kick us off here. I feel like this is a big question to start us off with, but that's okay. I think it has been a really challenging time across the board, right? I think COVID has brought about a lot of challenges that we did not see coming in the early childhood space. But I do think, even with that being said, I think the state really across the board has continued to make advancements and investments in early learning, particularly in programs like our pre-K counts programs, early intervention programs. So I think OCDEL is doing a phenomenal job with supporting a lot of those programs across the board, right? And for folks on either YouTube or Zoom, OCDEL is our Office of Child Development and Early Learning at the state level that really, provides support and oversees a lot of the early childhood programs across Pennsylvania, right? But I think, it would be wrong to say that we're not going through a really challenging time right now in early childhood, right? I mean, I think even just nationally, there's a huge staffing crisis in our profession in early childhood education. I think this is largely related to COVID, but I think we're experiencing this just generally as well, that, we are seeing a lot of challenges in staffing early childhood centers, providing compensation for our early childhood teachers, and really getting teachers into the classroom so that families can send their children to, high quality childcare centers as well. Again, to sort of think about what this looks like on the state level, though, I think Octel has been doing a lot of work around things like providing support for our professional development organizations. And I think higher ed institutions are also supporting a lot of early childhood providers on, the local levels as well. So yeah, that's sort of what I'm thinking about as we think about the current state of ECE.
So hi, I'm Sharon. I guess because of my mental health background, when I think about the state of anything, I think about how it impacts the state of social emotional development and the state of relationships. And the two of those, I think, are very interlinked across populations, but certainly for our youngest populations, children that would be enrolled in early care and education centers. And COVID has certainly impacted how we are in relationship across the board. And I'm not currently working in early care and education, but I have maintained some relationships with some folks in centers that I had established a relationship with over the years. And so have been back in early care and education centers, usually before or after hours, just because of the whole COVID protocols and whatnot. But the thing that really has stood out to me as I have gone into a few of those centers is how much different the process of even coming into the building is, and how many extra protocols have to be done. And Emily talked about, getting teachers in the room and, being able to have them to do the work that they do. And I think that early educators in particular, all educators have to build relationships with children, but we know that those relationships with children and then with families, because emotional development in general, particularly social emotional development for young kids, is so nested in those relationships that when you have something like the COVID epidemic that's going around the world, and it's so impacting relationships, parents and early care and education providers have so much to focus on. How do we keep kids physically safe? So if you think about needs, right, we have to meet physical safety first. And Oakdale, from what I can see, has done a good job, and the state has done a good job of really trying to make sure centers have direction and have resources to do that. But there has been this shift to, let's make sure that everyone is physically safe. And when you do that, it impacts relationships. And I think that, numbers of kids in classroom, lengthened hours. And so staff has long hours, or staff is coming in and out of classrooms throughout the day, has always impacted children and relationships. And so when you're really focusing on safety, because you have to in a pandemic, right? I get concerned about, are we losing some of the focus and some of the resources on relationships? And that's just in early care and education. Right now I'm working in early education. And so there's that transition between early care and education to early education, which I think has always been a stress point for families and kids. And now I don't even know if we're thinking about that at the moment, because we are really working so hard to maintain relationships in early care and education, and that's stressed by such a necessary heavy focus on physical safety.
Awesome. Thank you, Sharon. I actually you already answered and alluded to my next question, which was obviously how has COVID-19 impacted the state of ECE, but also you brought up resources, and I kind of want to delve further into that for both you and Emily. And so obviously the resources haven't changed with the pandemic. If anything, they've only increased. And so how do you think organizations and institutions prioritize and reorganize what is the most important resource and going about that? And if you all would just speak to that question, if that sort of made sense.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to start us off here. I think first and foremost, and I know I've already talked about this, but I think COVID has really only heightened the staffing shortages that we're seeing in ECE. Sharon has spoken a lot to, the physical barriers that are existing, because of various reasons and because of social distancing and whatnot. And, I think COVID has really only heightened a lot of these issues, right? I mean, we're seeing staffing shortages, we're seeing, compensation for our ECE professionals has been a long-standing issue across the board, right? And so, we're not seeing folks in the classroom because of wages and because of compensation, right? And I think these are really just persistent problems. I reside in South Philadelphia, and my neighbor directly next door to me, who owned two well-known centers in the city for 30 years, had to shut down her doors and was unable to reopen because of the pandemic. And so I think because of that, right, there is access barriers for families now, not being able to access centers that they might have previously had access to, right, which is obviously a whole strain of additional issues that we're seeing because of the pandemic, right? And then, furthermore, again, our teachers aren't able to come back to the buildings that they were once in, right? So I think that's one of the big pieces to this question, Sam. And I wanted to, right before this panel actually started today, I found out that PHMC, who is our professional development organization here in southeastern Pennsylvania, is providing a day of hire in a couple of days in response to the childcare staffing shortages, which I think is interesting. So over 600 programs in southeastern PA are coming together to sponsor what they're calling a day of hire, and providing, teachers and ECE professionals across the area with an opportunity to learn more about programs and see what programs have to offer in terms of incentives for applicants, things like signing bonuses, right? Higher salaries, benefit packages. So I think that's a clear, and sort of to tackle your next question, a clear response to how some of our professional development organizations and organizations outside of, our direct childcare providers are tackling these issues as a response to COVID. So I think that's just one example, and I'll, turn it over to Sharon for some additional thoughts.
Yeah, so I think I wanted to pull together a piece of what Sam said and a piece of what you said, Emily, in that sense of, Emily, you said, even staffed at what level facilities were staffed at prior to COVID, it was a challenge. So we had a staffing challenge. And I think that was very real. That's been very real for 10 or 15 years. I will never forget the day I was on a professional development for teachers. And there was one teacher there who was so excited to be there. And so I said to her afterwards, where is some of this excitement coming from? And she said, oh, I'm back to early care and education. I love early care and education. I'm trained as an educator. I love working in early care and education. But I had to leave for a few years. She was in a more rural area, so there weren't as many job opportunities in general. But she said, I had to leave early care and education for a couple of years because I just got too behind on my bills. And so I went to fast food for a while to catch up on my bills. And now that I'm caught up on my bills, I can come back to work in early care and education. And I just think I have never forgot that statement. And I just think that is a really challenging statement about how we are able to or choose to compensate people who do a really, really, really important, significant job. If people are saying, I'm leaving this job that I love and is really important to go work in fast food so I can catch up because I'm behind on my bills so that I can come back to work in this profession that I feel called to do, I think that's a pretty damning statement, first of all. So you have that whole staffing level piece, and then you layer COVID upon that. And like, there's been a lot of things in the news about restaurant workers who were initially laid off and then said, well, okay, I'm going to go find another job that's not so COVID averse, that I might be able to keep that job through COVID. I suspect that the same thing has happened on some level in early care and education, but I have not heard stories about that. And so then you have, maybe we were undercompensated, barely staffed before, and now you layer COVID upon that. And Sam, you said that the state and Octo have done a really good job of offering lots of resources. And in terms of some of the things that I've seen, I have seen that as well. The thing that I don't know, and so it's a question I raise, admittedly from ignorance, is have those resources been around what's going to allow us to maintain quality relationships while staff is stretched thinner? So has there been any change to say, you know what, we're going to lower the ratios so that there can be more teachers there, because now they're not only doing education and personal care around potty training and eating and cleaning surfaces, but also around risk mitigation for pandemic disease. And so I'm not knocking the state, because I think it's an incredibly hard job, but you raised the question of, like, how is it impacting children and children's development and families? And just like Emily said, there was a staffing challenge before COVID. I think in some instances, there was a ratio challenge before COVID. And when you have a ratio challenge and you add more responsibility, I think your ratio challenge becomes greater. And so I think specifically from COVID, we've not only seen a staffing challenge, but I would wonder if there's also there's more pushback and more challenge on that ratio reality that is sometimes a really hard reality. You go into a classroom and you have 8 and 9 kids out of 12 in a toddler classroom who need individualized services, and they might have early intervention or different providers coming in to support them. But now we're talking about COVID precautions for all this, one more responsibility. So I think less teacher availability, less availability for parents. Like, if my center closed and I have to go to another center, and that center had to reduce their numbers based on having lost staff, what are my chances of getting in there? And we know that there's been a waiting list in quality early care and education for a decade or more. So those are some of the things that I think they're challenges that early care and education has had for years that COVID has just shown a light on, or I suspect if you're an early care and education teacher, has really stressed you more.
Yeah, thank you guys both for sharing. I just want to move on to the next question. This kind of ties in back to the last question, but speaking upon the challenges the pandemic has given risen to, can you elaborate a little bit more about your experiences with mental health and early childhood education? Because I know you were talking a lot about staffing shortages and things closing down. So if you guys have any experience in that, that would be great to talk about too.
So Emily, I can jump in on this because that's really where most of my experience is in early care and education, because
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like this is your wheelhouse, and then I have probably some more personal stories that I can share, but go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, so I think it's wonderful that we are looking at social emotional development and early childhood mental health within early care and education. And I think that those needs have increased as time has gone on, as we're bringing more and more kids in earlier and earlier. And I think we were getting to a point where we were really, really focusing on, particularly in the younger age levels of kids, because you look at critical attachment phases of development, to say things like, how do we keep caregivers as consistent as possible for these younger children in those critical attachment phases. And then as kids get older, how do we continue to think about social emotional development and relationships when there's really a lot of pressure to have kids kindergarten ready, and for families, like where do we come in, and where's our relationship, and where's our connection in that. And so I think those kind of pieces are really important. And I think also a piece that we don't think about a lot is, where's racial equity in that? And so I think we look at questions of racial equity across the board in our culture. And I think when we look at them across education in general, but let's go to early care and education, we see that sometimes that kids who are from Black and Brown communities or families are coming into schools, or at least schools are reporting that they're coming in and they're less prepared. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is that? And so when we look at this is a very early childhood mental health piece, is when we look at expulsion rates. The expulsion rates for Black and Brown children from early care and education clear through high school are higher than they are for white children. And the highest expulsion rate, if you look at Walter Gilliam's work, the highest expulsion rate for kids in early care and education is the 3 B's: big, physically big Black boys. And when you look at geographical areas that have been really impacted financially and in terms of services that are available across the board, including in early care and education, some of those are in most at-risk neighborhoods. And so it's one more example, I'm sorry, of where we have seen challenges that we had around social emotional development, around implicit bias or racism coming into early care and education. And once again, there's the risk of that becoming a broader gap, or a bigger piece of concern for families and communities that are at higher risk.
I think there are so many points that Sharon just made that are not only resonating with me, but, I'm just sort of sitting with in terms of, what I'm seeing in the field and what I'm hearing from the field. I think generally when we think about mental health, right, it's our children and our families, and it also goes as much to think about like our teachers and our directors too, right? And so, I think right now, and I think this is across really the pre-K to 12 space, is like, there is this emphasis on taking care of your mental health during a global pandemic, right? And how do we do that as educators? And unfortunately, I think that in the ECE space, it is most affected because of a lot of the issues we've already discussed, right? Staffing shortages, having wait lists for children and families who can't access high quality centers, right? And so we, in a lot of the conversations I'm having with a lot of our directors right now, this takes a toll on your mental health, right? You know, just thinking about some of our directors who have to, you know, and this is not, I wouldn't say abnormal, right? We know our directors invest 150% of their time into the work that they do, but needing to step in to fill in for a teacher who is sick or is showing symptoms for COVID, right? Who can't be in a center, who's maybe working 16-hour days to fill in for teachers, and you know, spending 10 of those hours in a classroom, and the other 6 hours they need to put towards overseeing their center, right? And so I think there's this huge toll that is taking place right now on mental health of our ECE professionals. And then, you know, Sharon has already talked a lot about the mental health of our children and our families, right? And I think, you know, one of the things that I think about a lot is this emphasis on social emotional learning. And I sit back a lot of times and I think about even the shifts that Jumpstart has made as a program. I mean, back when I started, you know, when I was a member with Jumpstart, there was an emphasis on social emotional learning, but it wasn't as ingrained into our curriculum as a program as it is now. And so I think, you know, there is a recognition of the need to sort of intertwine social emotional skills and social emotional opportunities into the learning that's happening in our classrooms. And I think that's not only on the center level, but also within organizations like Jumpstart that are sort of supplementing the work that's happening in our classrooms, right? And I just want to like also, I think, highlight Sharon's point about implicit bias. And I think this is a huge term that we've been talking about for years, right? And thinking about the biases that educators and volunteers come into our classrooms with, right? And I think one thing that we really talk about is supporting our children's mental health by allowing them to see themselves in the people that work with them, right? And who can relate to them. And I think that helps in so many different ways when children can connect with, you know, I think of like storybooks, right? Stories where they see themselves in the characters, or they have a teacher who, you know, who looks like them, or who can speak to their experiences that they're going through on a daily basis, and understands where they're coming from. And I think that requires, again, like us to be like, as a profession, cognizant of like who we're hiring into the field, right? And also being cognizant of the biases that we bring into our classroom and how we relate to children overall.
Thank you for both answering that question. And kind of moving into the next question, I wanted to ask, we talked about a lot about initiatives and how mental health has really inserted itself into these changing times in ECE. And I want to ask, what initiatives have been implemented over the past few years to improve early childhood education, in addition to what we had just talked about? And also, what other improvements do you think need to occur, and what you foresee happening in the future?
So I think one of the huge changes that I saw a while ago in my tenure when I was in early care and education was the first the creation and then the expansion of the pre-K counts classrooms. And there has also been some expansion in Head Start classrooms. And with that came, first of all, higher pay for teachers. And so you saw, I think one of the really challenging growing pains about that as that program came on board was that teachers who were in the pre-K counts classrooms were paid higher than teachers who were in other classrooms in the same facility. And so there have been some challenges with that. But I think, and there were a lot of growing pains with that, but I think that along with that came the push and the support to provide ongoing education for people who had worked in early care and education for years. And so there was a lot of growing pains with that coming into place. But I think there's been a push to provide more varied and more easy access to ongoing and higher education for early care and education teachers. And I think that has been really very important. I also think with the Head Start classrooms, and so there's Head Start classrooms that are at a Head Start facility, and then lots of early care and education facilities have a Head Start classroom that is supported. So that the children are enrolled through the early care and education facilities, but because they're eligible for Head Start, they're enrolled in the Head Start classroom, and then they're paired with a Head Start professional who comes out usually once a week to work with the teachers in that classroom and to also do planning and supports for those teachers. And so both with Head Start and the expansion of Head Start and pre-K counts, I think we see more support and more resources for the teachers that are teaching in those classrooms. And I think that has been a significant support to those teachers. And I think you've seen improvements at those age levels, and that the teachers have felt more supported at those age levels. And there has been talk, and there continues to be talk about expanding that to, universal pre-K. And I think that would be helpful. And there is occasionally some talk about expanding that, clear down to infants and toddlers. And I think it would make, I get it. I get there's the taxation challenge. There's the where do you spread your resources challenge, those kind of things. But if you're asking for, where have there been specific programs that have made a big difference? I think those are some of the programs. And then if the next question is, what are the next programs, or what's the expansion of those programs? It would make sense that universal pre-K becomes a next step. But then I think there's this question of how do we expand that down to 6 weeks and onward? How do we provide those same kind of quality supports and services for early care and education teachers who are working with some of the most vulnerable children? And I don't just mean vulnerable because they have a special need or a physical challenge, or because they come from a low income population, but I mean because they are 6 weeks and 2 years, and in some ways powerless people who are in key phases of development. How do we as and this is a way broader question than this panel is going to address, but how do we prioritize for the most vulnerable in our population who need to grow up to be intellectually, emotionally, physically well-developed, well-rounded, confident people to lead our country to the next place that we need to be? And so that, I know that's a huge broad piece, but I think it's a continuation of that question of where have we seen the most gains? And then, okay, we've seen those gains. Now what's the logical next step or next series of steps?
Yeah, so to sort of build on that, I mean, I'm thinking about this question even from like a programming initiative, because I am sort of in that space so consistently right now. And so generally speaking, I think there have been a lot of efforts made on the state level to sort of, as we think about, initiatives that have been implemented that have supported, I think, providers and children and families across the board. The one that I think of specifically is, efforts to support children with disabilities. And Sharon mentioned this earlier, but, OCDL's resources and statement on inclusive early learning environments, reducing expulsion and suspension rates for all students, especially those with disabilities, I think, continues to be a success across programs, across the state, which I think is really helpful and really ties nicely, I think, to our previous conversation around, how does some of the work that we're doing support mental health, right? I think on more of a city level, specifically here in Philly, we have seen the rollout of the PHL pre-K program, which has been a wonderful opportunity to provide free, high quality pre-K to over 10,000 children since 2017, which I think is great. And is, continues to see success across a lot of childcare centers across the city. And then I think even here, at Temple, we're thinking about initiatives and ways that we're constantly, providing supports for the ECE field. And one of the projects that I am working on with a faculty member is our DEAL Fellowship, which stands for Diversifying Early Education Leadership. And it's a fellowship that is funded through the William Penn Foundation and is based out of, our College of Education and Human Development here at Temple, and ultimately provides mid-career professionals of color in the early childhood space with a chance to network and learn from one another and support one another and learn from organizations that are fueling the early childhood work in the city. And so that has been I think a phenomenal effort between, I don't want to boast about the project, but between, our college and the William Penn Foundation to really amplify those voices of professionals in this space and provide them with these opportunities to grow on their leadership and, have a seat at the table, if you will, right? I'm also thinking a lot, and I keep going back to Jumpstart, but it's relevant in this space. I'm thinking a lot about the workforce initiatives that are happening across our Jumpstart organization, not only here in Philly, but across the country, right? And I'm thinking about how, as an organization, we are providing more direct opportunities for our college students to see what a career in ECE is like post-graduation, right? Again, going back to those staffing challenges, we know that college students leave school with a ton of debt. If they're not compensated well in ECE, they're going to pursue other options. And so the workforce programs that are sort of, being situated across our Jumpstart program nationally are there to support college students to see how they can build their careers in the early childhood education field. And so, specifically here at Temple, we're doing that by through a teacher mentorship model. So having our core members work really closely with in-service teachers, right? Teachers who have been in the early childhood field for 10 plus years, and working with them on a regular basis to understand what their day-to-day really looks like beyond, just what, we provide in terms of the Jumpstart session and classroom service overall. And so that, I think, is just one example of an initiative that, we're sort of tackling here at Temple to help, build these bridges for a lot of individuals across the board. To sort of scale that back a little bit as well. I think one thing that I'm consistently thinking of is the ELRCs across the state, which is our early learning resource centers that are sort of situated in different areas across the Commonwealth. And, those were rolled out a couple years ago to support providers and families in their designated areas, right? And I think they have made really, substantial gains in certain areas of the Commonwealth. But I also think that there's a lot of, I don't want to say work is not the right term, but I think there is some visibility that needs to be made in those certain regions to allow for, not only providers, but also families to know like where to access their ELRCs and how to obtain resources from them and whatnot. And so I think that has been a little bit challenging because of the pandemic and because of the times that we're in. But, I think one of the things that I'm thinking about is how do we really promote the ELRCs and make them visible to everyone so that they know that they are a resource for different folks.
Awesome.
Emily, I think that rollout of the ELRCs was challenging because I think the ELRCs rolled out in July of 19. And when you think about that in the midst of the pandemic, like they were getting up and running and just kind of starting to do that, like they did the transition work and were only beginning to do some of that visibility work, and COVID hit.
Yep.
And so that's definitely going to impact any new organization or new initiative going forward. So I think you're right. That's a big piece that's got to come back as we kind of come back from COVID and really try to find some sense of normal. Those ELRCs are going to have to negotiate that piece of like, okay, how do we come back to the normal when we weren't even kind of out our normal stride?
We were just getting our bearings.
Yeah, that's a big challenge.
Yeah.
But I think when you talked to the program that you talked about in terms of diversity and leadership in early care and education, that Temple is doing and his partner is doing through a foundation, I think that sounds really exciting. And I think it's worth mentioning that piece of like what's the relationship or the dynamic between, as we try to think forward and push things forward, that piece of foundations and universities and the state, and there's so much fertile ground there that happens and moves things forward. And so situated within the ELRCs or connected to the ELRCs, the program that I used to work with, the Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation Program, is a program that started in 2006. And it was funded by the Heinz Endowments and the folks from the University of Pittsburgh Office of Child Development and folks from Penn State. And I am sorry, I'm not remembering the specific. Cacti was their office, which was not a parallel to the Office of Child Development, but it was a similar kind of a flavor of thing. And so those programs kind of got together and began that project. And it was supposed to be a 2-year pilot project. And we got 1 year in, and there was enough noticeable improvement from that program that then the state folks came in and said, Octo came in and said, we want to take that next year. We're gonna kick in some funding to that, and we want to take the next year and try to expand that across the state. And it's been a slow expansion over 15 years, and it's been a solidification of that program to the point where in 2019, the state said, we really want to take all of the strengths that we've had from different places across the state and pull those together and run that program directly out of Oakdale. And so that's a program that's an amazing resource. Any early care and education program in the state can contact either the Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation Program directly, contact their regional supervisor, or if they don't know how to do that, and that goes back to Emily's piece of what's the visibility and how do people know how to connect with their ELRC, they can contact their ELRC and say, hey, put me in touch with this consultant. I need to think about social emotional development in my classroom, or I have one particular child who we're trying to work with the family and we need some supports. The family and my staff need some supports to try to think about how do we support the social emotional development of this one particular child. So that's another program that has happened in the last 20 years that I think has been a tremendous resource to families and to ECE providers.
thank you both for answering those. I love just hearing your perspectives and all the experiences and stories you bring. And we're towards the end, so I just have a few more questions as we toward the end of our event. But specifically to Sharon, and when we're talking about bringing you on as panelists and stuff, you mentioned that we had adult reading communities or adult learning communities, and I kind of just wanted to ask what that looked like and how that was, and also alluding this to Emily so you can prepare for your question too, in terms of how do outside communities and institutions support the work that you do in helping ECE grow?
I'm sorry, were you directing that question to me at Adult Learning Communities?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So right now I'm not working in early care and education, I'm working in early elementary education. And so 3Rs is a part of the Pittsburgh study, which is an Allegheny County initiative that's looking at supporting initiatives to improve child thriving across a generation. And there are 6 age cohorts that run from prenatal to high school graduation. And so the group that I am working with is the early education cohort. And so we are looking at how do you support, because by 3rd grade, there is that marker that says we really want to be aware of children's reading abilities, not just their reading level, but their literacy and reading abilities across the board, because there's a phrase of until 3rd grade, you learn to read, and after 3rd grade, you read to learn. And so that becomes a really significant childhood marker. And so the team that I work on really looks at, and again, it goes back to that relationship piece or that connection piece is how do the adults support each other? And so across all of the groups that we work with, whether it's teachers or administrators or literacy support organizations that may do after school programs or go in as resources into programs, we are using adult learning communities to look at issues and questions like, and our 3Rs are reading, racial equity, and relationships. So we may bring a speaker in. So for example, I was just involved in something last week where we brought a speaker in to speak on the importance of loving Black children. You know, when you are serving, particularly if you are a white teacher in a white administrator or a white staff member in a literacy support organization, and you're supporting or you're going into and working in a school or a neighborhood where the majority of the population is not white, how do you think about what that means? And how do you think about all of the things that the children who are coming to your program are experiencing day to day? And how do you care deeply for that child and that family? And how do you lead with that to impact that child's life, to reach them in terms of what do they need and what do they support? And I think it was you, Sam, who said earlier, books that are representative. Like, how do you think about the types of books that you bring in to work with kids, and how does that impact their relationship? And we're doing all of that in adult learning communities where we bring people in and we provide information and we ask each other really hard questions. And then again, whether it's a group of teachers from a particular school, if it's a learning community across schools, if it's a group of educational leaders from across districts, to say, how do you think about these things? And just take an hour a month or 2 hours, the different learning communities are different lengths, but how do you take that time to really invest in that and then go back and change what you're doing for the better? And we're doing that because there's a lot of research that suggests that professional development is important, but it's that adult learning community where people are actually reflecting and then putting in practice and coming back and talking about, how do I put that in practice, that you get more movement. And so when we think about, I would say one thing that we could do, and this is probably my closing comment, is how do we think about using those adult learning communities in early care and education? And I know there have been some efforts to do that, and that kudos for that. And I would say that's one place where we need to continue to think about that, not just providing ongoing PD, but how does that PD look at becoming adult learning communities to really support that process at a really deep level.
Thank you. More specifically for you, Emily, you might have been maybe hopefully brewing this thought, but I know you work like funding, and that involves like a lot of money and grants and like policies. And so how, from your perspective of working in ECE, what support do you find supporting the ECE community?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, so I'm sort of thinking about this in a few different layers, because I'm thinking about this right from like an institutional perspective, from a programming perspective, but then I'm also thinking about it from an individual perspective, right? So I think from like an institution of higher education, like a jumpstart level, right? You know, I think it's just really a matter of like, you know, showcasing the work, right? I mean, specifically, you know, we know here in the city of Philly, right, two of our biggest foundations that fund early childhood high quality work, right, are the William Penn Foundation and Vanguard. And so, you know, it's important as we are putting together proposals or thinking about like what work is really going to propel us forward, to think about like what these foundations are looking for, and what type of projects they've funded in the past, right? And how can we think about like a new project or a project we currently have, and sort of fit, you know, what they're looking for into what we are requesting, you know, funds for, if you will. And, you know, I mean, I will be honest, we haven't always, you know, some projects are better than others, right? And some get funded and some don't. Sharon, I'm sure you know that. And so, you know, I don't want to say like we've had a 100, or like I personally have had a 100% success rate, and I'll, you know, be the first one to say that. But, you know, we have, I think I've been a part of a lot of projects that have been very successful. You know, I think because of the relationships that we've built with funders, and because, you know, they see the potential in the projects that they're funding, right? You know, I'm thinking about like in particular our Jumpstart Workforce project right now, which is in part being funded by Vanguard. And you know, there was this large interest in this teacher mentorship piece, which has really shaped our trajectory of the Jumpstart Philadelphia program as a whole. And so I really, you know, just see funders, yes, obviously they're a great monetary resource, right? But they have so many skilled program officers and professionals on their team that help us to really drive our work in ECE forward, and help us to sort of get a space where we sit back and we're like, oh, we didn't even consider doing that with a project, or like, oh, that's a really interesting way to think about how we do X, Y, or Z, right? And so definitely, you know, Sharon talked a lot about relationships in the beginning of the panel, and you know, I didn't talk about this much, but I think relationships are at the heart of like what we do in early childhood, right? And specifically for me, I know they've been at the heart of a lot of my work as well. Sort of related but unrelated on the individual level, I was thinking a lot, Sam, about, you know, and because I work so closely with college students specifically, you know, I'm always thinking about like, how do my college students stay engaged in the ECE field, even like after they leave Jumpstart or after they graduate, right? And so I think one thing that I would always like encourage people to do, whether you are a college student or you know, in another field, and you just want to stay on top of what's happening in the ECE space in your city or in the state, is to like sign up for listservs, right? Like Octal has a number of listservs. You know, I know organizations in Philly, like First Up, send out email blasts specifically around like, you know, how are we advocating for X, you know, this week? Or like Octal will send out like, you know, announcements or resources that are, impacting childcare centers across the state. And so, like, it seems so simple, but just like having access to that information helps, at least for me, to stay on top of like what's going on, right? Not only on the state level, but in the city as well. Same with like PHMC as our professional development organization. Just getting information from them on a regular basis has been really helpful. The other thing that I'm like sort of thinking about as well is like learning from our local leaders and just advocacy work in general. If you watch the news, you are hearing more and more lately about the need for us to fund childcare across the country, right? And yes, I realize this has been like an ongoing conversation, but we wouldn't be hearing about it if we didn't have advocates on the ground level speaking for this work, right? And so, I always just encourage students and adults alike to continue advocating for ECE and the need for high quality early child care education across the country. I think my last bit related, but sort of unrelated is like, I always like press our college students to like, consider a career in early childhood education, right? And consider the benefits that it brings. And so, we've talked a lot tonight about the need for teachers and staff, our staffing crisis. And so I'll just end it by saying like, we need teachers and we need high quality teachers. And, please don't be afraid to pursue a career in that space.
Thank you so much for both for speaking on that this past hour. Can't believe it flew by so quickly. And then Emily actually already answered kind of my next and wrapping up question, which was how can individuals support ECE and contribute to its growth locally and nationally? And very briefly, if y'all just both want to touch on this to end the event, obviously we're at the University of Pittsburgh, and really our audience right now would probably be like college students, and obviously not everyone is in ECE and looking to childhood education. And so just really quickly, what y'all would say for them to get involved, like where to look to resources, like just how to get started and go about just being engaged with that, with this field.
So, sorry,
Sharon. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think you could go, I think Jumpstart specifically at the University of Pittsburgh is a great resource. I'm going to plug you all again, but a great resource to reach out to if you're a college student, right? To, network. I mean, your site managers are wonderful individuals who could, point you as a college student in the right direction to access resources on the local level. I'm not super familiar with resources out in Pittsburgh, but I, know of a handful here in Philly. And then, you can always go to Ocdel's website and browse their various programs and sign up, like I said, for newsletters to stay on top of what's really happening on the state level, right? One other thing I will also say is, if you aren't a college student and you're watching this today, and I think specifically about like our providers, is I think even more and more recently I've been hearing from providers in my role, in this role that I'm in the college. And if you're watching this and you are a provider or you're connected with a provider, I think I'd encourage everyone to get in touch with their local higher education institution. I think sometimes that isn't a space that providers think about accessing for resources or for as a partnership. And we've, in my role, been able to build some really wonderful partnerships with local early childhood organizations or centers or providers, simply because I received an email asking for them to have a conversation. And so, I think that's really important as well. But go ahead, Sharon. Sorry to cut you off before.
So I always go to the point of there's nothing so valuable as experience. And so I would say, I know that anybody who's involved in Jumpstart is going into early care and education classrooms, right? That's a big piece of what you all do. But if there are folks who are listening to this or participating that don't have that as natural an access point to early care and education, if you're thinking about early care and education, really consider finding a way to have an experience that puts you in an early care and education facility where you can experience what it is. And I would say do some homework, because there's such a range of what is our focus, and a range of quality too, in terms of what's out there in early care and education. And so I think, do your due diligence to do that. And I also just think, if it's possible, and I know scheduling is an issue, both with what classes you're taking and where do you have transportation to things and what's happening in the facility, but it always stuck out to me that the same early care and education class facility and the same early care and education classroom could look very different at different times of day. And so one of the things that I think students often miss in their education in terms of going into classrooms that they have to do, like if I'm a student today and I'm having my student experience and I graduate tomorrow and maybe I take a week off and then next week I'm an early care and education teacher, one of the things that you have to be able to do really, really well that I don't think a lot of students get exposure to is interacting with parents. And so when you're thinking about your experience of being in a classroom, it's going to be a whole lot more challenging in terms of your schedule and the early care and education center's schedule. But if you're going in between, 9 or 9:30 and 11:30 or 12:30, or not a lot of folks are in there for nap time, so they tend to leave. So there's the morning group, there's the morning students and the afternoon students, right? And neither of those times is kind of grouped around how do you interact with parents. And I would bet, so if you're on this call and you're a student and you're close to graduate, you're going to graduate at the end of this year, like how many opportunities have you had to be in early care and education and see what it looks like to interact with a parent and family members? And so I guess that's the challenge that I would throw out, is to say, find your way to do that. Because that, when we go back to that relationship piece, there's got to be that relationship with the students. Yeah. And we all love that piece, and we're good at in schools of education. That's what we teach, right? But we also have to do that family engagement and family interaction piece, because that is so, I think it's critical. I have an 11th grader. I think it's critical at that point. But I think it's really very, very critical in early care and education. So that's a piece that I would say you're going to have, I would challenge you as a student to go out and get that exposure.
Thank you, Sharon and Emily, both. I totally resonate with getting that exposure and having that experience. And I think just being here and talking and listening to both of y'all was a great experience for myself. And I hope everyone else who was joining us, that it was for you too. And I just want to say one last thank you to both of y'all for taking the time and being here today and sharing your experiences and perspectives with us. That this does bring us to the end of our event, so sort of concluding it. But we unfortunately didn't have time for Q&A. But I do want to say that Civic Action Week, again, this was just one part of it, the university of week-long initiative of service and all those things. And so if you're still watching this, it's a week-long event, and there's still a bunch of opportunities and events that you can sign up for, and you can find more information on that on our website, which is pi.tt/Civic Action Week. And so yeah, just thank you everyone for participating and having for me, like a very good and memorable time for this event. But yeah, I think that's it for me. And Sriana, if you want to add anything to that.
I just want to thank you all again. It was so wonderful hearing you guys speak. But again, thank you for coming out today. And thank you to everyone who was listening on YouTube and also who attended this event on Zoom. We really appreciate you guys as well. But yeah, that's all I have to say as well.
Thank you both for inviting us.
Yes, thank you.